Hi, PSych. This is Module 59. This is the last set of notes for this unit, and actually our last full set of new notes for the year. Anything we do after this will be more instructional review, but not new content. So our topic for today is social cognitive theories and exploring the self. The first half, we're going to revisit a psychologist we've talked about before, Albert Bandura. And then we'll be talking about things related to ourselves, self-efficacy, narcissism, a little bit of everything today. So again, our essential question is, how do psychologists explain personality? Our learning targets are, I can compare and contrast the behaviorist and social cognitive theories of personality with other theories of personality. 2, I can speculate how cultural context can facilitate or constrain personality development, especially as it relates to self-concept. So at the end, we'll be talking about a collectivistic versus individualistic cultures. And then finally, I can identify key contributors to personality. An old name comes up again, and that's Albert Bandura. Hopefully you've associated him with the Bobo doll and observational learning. So first we're going to look at social cognitive theories, which are very much rooted in behaviorism. So the social cognitive perspective views our behaviors as being influenced by the interaction between our traits, including the way that we think, that'll be important here in a moment with cognition, and their social context, meaning what's going on around them. And this was proposed again by Albert Bandura, so it kind of makes sense if you think about Bandura did a lot of research on observational learning. So if we look at personality from his perspective, it's going to be very much influenced by what's going on around us. We also have a large influence of a behavioral approach here. So in personality theory, this perspective focuses on the effects of learning on our personality development. To bring this together with social cognitive, we learn through observing and imitating others, but what we think about our situations affects our behaviors, and this is going to emphasize the interaction of people and their situations. So what does this actually look like? What this is going to boil down to sounds really fancy. I promise it's not that difficult. It's something called reciprocal determinism. So to introduce you to the topic, I have this short video for you. It's a great Khan Academy. It's like 3 minutes long, and then I'll walk you through it again just to make sure we're good to go. So here you go.
Social cognitive perspectives view behavior as being influenced by the interaction between people's traits or cognitions and their social context. So if one of the general themes of psychology is the interaction between nature and nurture, we can think of the social cognitive perspective as talking about the interactions between an individual and the situation that they are in. So let's say that Megan here has an interest in playing soccer, and because of that, she joins the soccer team. And as a result, she starts to spend a lot of time with the soccer players. So here we have a cognition, the interest in playing soccer, and this leads her to join a certain environment to hang out in this case, the soccer team. And as a result of being on the soccer team, she starts to spend a lot of time with the soccer players. So you can see how a cognition can lead to choosing a certain environment, which can then change our behavior. But you can also see how things could be ordered a bit differently. Maybe Megan is new in town, and she winds up hanging out with people who are on the soccer team because she shares a lot of classes with them, so she sees them a lot. And these friends, perhaps unsurprisingly, spend a lot of time talking about soccer. And so Megan starts to become really interested in it. And as a result, she decides to join the soccer team. So here we have a behavior that leads to a cognition, which eventually leads her to choose a certain environment. And we can also follow the circle in the opposite direction. So once again, let's say that Megan is new in town and she starts to hang out with the soccer players. And because she likes hanging out with them, she decides to join the soccer team just so she can hang out with them even more. But then, after playing for a while, she starts to develop a real interest in the game. And of course, now that she's on the team and now that she's really interested in the game, this reinforces her behavior of hanging out with the team, both on and off the field. So here we have a behavior that leads to an environment, which then leads to a cognition, which at the same time serves to reinforce the behavior. So we see that these three things, behavior, cognition, and environmental factors, are actually all intertwined. And they're intertwined in such a way that they actually all rely on each other. And as a result, we are shaped by the interaction of these three factors. And this is what social cognitive theorists refer to as reciprocal determinism, which is just a really fancy way of saying what we were saying before. That these three things, behavior, cognition, and environment, are all determinants of one another. And this theory was put forth by Bandura. And if his name sounds familiar, it should, because he's also the scientist who did a lot of work on observational learning, or learning that occurs by watching the behavior of others, which I think works really well with reciprocal determinism, because it implies that learning and changes in our behavior are gained through our interactions with others and through our observation of the behavior of others, which I think fits in really nicely with this cycle.
Okay, so let's walk through this. So, reciprocal determinism, by definition, is this interaction between three key components, as we just heard in the video. So, it's looking at the influences of behavior, of cognition, and environment. And sometimes you see this like kind of ABC scenario, but you'll see it's really those same three components, just named a little bit differently as a mnemonic. So, just like what we saw in the diagram with the girl playing soccer, we have our cognition, we have environmental factors, and we have behavior. Okay? And as they talked about in the video, the thing to look for is that these arrows can move in any direction. It can start at any place. Okay? So, like they said originally, let's say these examples are about rock climbing. That you, in general, like the thought of doing something risky. That's an internal cognition. So that leads you to thinking, I'm going to spend time with people who think likewise, and maybe these people climb rocks. Okay? Then that might lead you to learn a new behavior to learn to rock climb. Okay? Or it can start down here with behavior. You think, I really want to learn how to rock climb. I'm going to make some rock climbing friends because I'm out doing it. That makes me think, what else can I try? And it can go again any of these directions. The key thing is to understand that cognition, environment, and behavior all influence each other. So, same thing, just some things to point out. This idea that different people choose different environments. So we choose our environment, but then that environment shapes us. So for my seniors, you guys are in the process right now of choosing what college or where to go after high school, whether it's military or work or university or whatever it may be. You're choosing what that next environment's going to be. And what you'll find is no matter what you choose, that environment will start to shape you, whether it's leads to changes in your behavior, whether it leads to changes in your thoughts, but it shapes you even though you made the decision to go there. Two, we know our personalities shape how we interpret and react to events. So if you're already more anxious looking at that cognition piece, you're more attuned to potentially threatening events, and that might affect your behavior. Okay? We also know that our personalities help to create situations to which we react. So if I'm always expecting other people to be angry with me, I may give them the cold shoulder or act really cold towards them, which then makes them angry at me. Okay? So key thing to remember, and I'm going to have you give your own example here in a minute, just as a heads up, is behavior, environment, cognition, all three affect each other. So I'd like you to give your own example of reciprocal determinism in action. If you want to use a sport example of going off to college, a hobby, whatever you would like. So go ahead and write. Okay, so there's no way for me to give every possible example because I don't don't know what you're writing, but the key thing you want to look for in your example is, did you include some sort of cognitive piece? Did you include an environmental piece? And did you include a behavioral piece? And mention that each of those has an effect on the others. And if you did, then you're probably spot on. So this is just a reminder. Gotta love our biopsychosocial influence, just like everything else we've talked about throughout the year. And we know that it has a heavy influence on personality. So I want you to imagine something, and this is to give me an example to work with. I want you to imagine that you failed a terms quiz. Luckily, we don't have those weighing on us right now, but just imagine. Okay? I would want you to write down 2 reasons why you think you failed. So, quiz in the past, okay, or future if you didn't do well. Why might that be? So, go ahead and take a moment and write those down. Okay, so let's talk about what that says about this idea of attributional style. Okay? So, an attributional style is, what do you attribute your performance to? And generally, people have, and it could depend on the circumstances, it could switch, a more pessimistic attributional style or a more optimistic attributional style. Sorry, it's late, I'm stumbling. So, first, for pessimistic, you might say that the reason you didn't do well on that quiz was because of things that were out of your control. Someone forced you to stay up really late. Your teacher didn't tell you, didn't remind you that you had the quiz, you didn't study. Maybe you tell yourself, like, I'm not smart enough to be able to do well. That's a pessimistic attributional style. Where more optimistic, you would say your performance is due to your choices and your understanding over things that you can control. So you might say something like, I just didn't study like I should have. Or, it was really hard, I tried my best, and it is what it is. I just didn't perform well on this particular test. Okay? So think about, were your answers more pessimistic or more optimistic in terms of attributional style? Believe it or not, there is a such thing as having too much optimism. I know we always say be optimistic, and oftentimes being optimistic is a great thing, but sometimes it's helpful to be more real as well. Okay? So realism can help to motivate performance. So for example, if I'm real with myself about what I know, think about your AP exams coming up. If you are overly optimistic, you might not study as much as you need to do well. Okay. So if you know, like, ooh, there's a lot of stuff I don't remember from the beginning of the year, you might be more motivated to actually study and do the things you need to do to make sure that you're prepared. Okay. The downside of optimism is it blinds us to risks. It makes us feel like we're less vulnerable to bad things happening to us. With everything going on in the world right now with COVID-19, if you're excessively optimistic, if you think, there's no way I'm going to get the virus, I'm going to be fine, that may lead you to take a lot of risks, like going out and hanging out with people and acting like everything's fine, which puts you at even more risk to contract the virus. Something else, illusory optimism about groups. An illusion, it's right there for us. We often overestimate how often our team will win, whether it's an athletic team, a performance team, whatever the case may be. So I kind of mentioned this already, is when we're overly optimistic, we might be blind to our own incompetence. Okay, meaning we don't realize what we don't know. Like, if you don't know it, how do you know that you don't know it? And this is why I know y'all probably aren't too fond of when I have you guys mark like learning targets. But the idea behind that is to prevent this from happening. Because if you have to face those learning targets and go, oh, do I really know this? Do I really not know this? It keeps us from being too overconfident. Okay. And the thing is, when we think we're good at something, it drives how we perceive ourselves doing. If I think I'm good, okay, then I think I'm really good. But I maybe am not the best assessor of my own performance. So if you want an honest assessment, ask someone else. A great example, lots of us probably sing in our cars or in the shower. And when we're singing by ourselves, those of us that maybe aren't great singers, when I'm alone in my car, I sound awesome. But if someone else were to listen to me, like my kids, my daughter especially, she'll give me the look like, Mom, no, just stop. Okay. So that's some honest assessment. It kind of keeps me in my place. So assessing behavior in situations. So how can we best assess how someone does? Is to explore how people interact or behave in more realistic situations. So for example, if we want to know if someone is going to be a good teacher in the future, rather than just saying, oh, you're good with kids, or I'm sure you're great, is let's actually put them in the classroom, like as a student teacher, and let's see how they do. Okay, that gives us a much more realistic assessment of how that person is. So this is key, and I know it's going to sound kind of cliche. The best way to predict future behavior is behavior patterns in similar situations. Okay. This is why if you break your parents' trust, go out to a party when you didn't say you were going, why they get upset and they don't want to trust you next time, because past performance predicts future behavior. Related to a lot of these ideas, I've talked about this, I think, a little bit before, is a branch of psychology called positive psychology. And positive psychology is a little bit different than a lot of the things that we've talked about, where rather than looking at kind of people's deficiencies, positive psychology is looking at optimal human functioning. Like, how can we promote people's strengths and virtues to help the person themselves as well as their communities thrive? Okay. This is led by Martin Seligman. Little reminder, Seligman is the same psychologist who did the learned helplessness studies. And another fun fact, he was also involved in the Rosenhan study. Those were the people that went into the mental hospitals around the country and kind of got stuck in there. And think of positive psychology as very kind of similar realm as humanistic perspective, but there's a much more scientific methodology behind it. Just kind of fun local fact, we have a couple world-renowned positive psychologists within our area. One of the most influential is Dr. Csikszentmihalyi, and he is at the Claremont Colleges. We have another psychologist, I'm blanking out on her name in the moment, that talks a lot about gratitude. She is a professor at UC Riverside. So this area, there's a lot of positive psychology stuff going on. It's one of my favorite parts of psychology. Okay, just a little bit more is exploring the self. So what do we mean by the self? In contemporary psychology is assumed to be the center of the personality, the organizer of our thoughts, feelings, and actions. Related to the self, some of you probably have experienced this before, is something called the spotlight effect. And the spotlight effect is where we think that other people notice and evaluate our appearance, our performance, our mistakes way more often than they actually do. I don't know about you all, but I've been walking on campus before, like going up the steps from the Banyan Circle. I'll walk up those steps and I've fallen a couple times. Okay. And when you fall, it feels like all eyes on you. Like everyone in the whole quad saw you do it, whatever you did. Okay. Did a few people notice? Maybe. Did everyone notice? Probably not. It's just the spotlight effect thinking, making us think that more people notice than actually do. So if we talk about self, we got to talk about self-esteem. So self-esteem is a person's feelings of either high or low self-worth. Okay, high or low self-worth. We know that having higher self-esteem is beneficial People with higher self-esteem or that high self-worth fall less to peer pressure. They tend to persist at difficult tasks and tend to be happier. Related to, but different from, and this is a term I need you to know, I've seen it pop up a lot of times on the AP exam on FRQs, is self-efficacy. And really what this boils down to is your sense of, am I capable of doing it? So for example, if I have high self-efficacy about the AP exam, I know that I'm capable of doing well. If you have a low self-efficacy, let's say taking your driver's test, okay, you walk into that test thinking that you won't be able to do it. Okay. But if you have high self-efficacy, it's not being to the point of cocky or overconfident, but it's a feeling like I have the skills, I can do this task. Okay, so remember that one, self-efficacy. So what I'd like you to do is explain the difference between self-esteem and self-efficacy. So hopefully what you said, kind of key words for self-esteem is self-worth, and self-efficacy, kind of the key phrase is, am I capable? So again, high self-efficacy, I'm capable of completing whatever the task behavior that I need to do. Self-serving bias. This is our readiness to perceive ourselves favorably. Okay? We want to see ourselves in a positive light. Okay? And what this leads us to do are things like we accept more responsibility for good deeds that we do, okay, than bad. I'm more likely to say, yeah, I did that good thing. Yeah, I held that door open for you. I'm much more likely to claim credit for that than the times where I left the door closed in someone's face. And I'm more likely to accept responsibility for my successes rather than my failures. We tend to see ourselves as better than average. And kind of the interesting thing, and we'll talk about this right at the very end, is self-serving bias is more common in Western cultures or individualistic cultures and less common in Asian cultures where modesty is valued. So I'd like you to give me an example of the self-serving bias. If someone was being affected by this, what would you expect them to say or do? So you can give some sort of scenario. What would you expect them to say or do? Okay, so no matter what example you wrote down, I would expect that you said something like, whatever they did, they saw themselves in a positive light. They were more likely to see themselves positively than they were likely to see themselves negatively. Narcissism. This is something that you've probably heard of before. So narcissism is defined as excessive self-love and self-absorption. We know that narcissism levels are actually rising. Sometimes, especially young people, Generation Z is known as Generation Me, very much correlated with social media. If you scroll your social media, and I'm not saying everyone that posts a selfie is narcissistic, but there's definitely more a focus on oneself. Okay. So some criticism of self-serving bias. We tend to all feel inferior at times. So self-serving bias isn't always there. This is particularly true when we're comparing ourselves with others. Think about, I'm sure I've done it. I would guess that many of you have done it, where you're scrolling Instagram or whatever your social media is, or even just looking around the classroom or amongst your friends and family. And when you start thinking about their looks or their physique or their intelligence or what school they got into or what their GPA is, it's hard to not feel inferior to them. And finally, we're almost done. This is our last couple concepts, is culture and the self. So looking at individualism versus collectivism. So individualistic cultures give priority to one's own goals, so the individual's goals, over the group goal. and define their identity in terms of personal attributes rather than group identification. And individualistic cultures are places like North America, including the United States, Western Europe, Australia, New Zealand. And if we to pull Mr. Kirk's saying here, this would be more I is greater than we. Yeah. It's all about me, my accomplishments. What did I do? How does this help me? Where on the other hand, collectivist cultures give priority to the goals of one's group, often one's extended family or work group, and define their identity accordingly. So they see themselves not as an individual so much as a member of a family or a member of this particular workplace. And collectivism is very much we is greater than I. So what does this look like in terms of values? You can see here about the self. People see themselves as very much independent, where collectivism is more interdependent. They gain their identity from belonging rather than individual traits. The life task in individualistic cultures is to discover how you're unique. More in collectivism is more trying to maintain connections, to fit in, to perform the role that the group needs you to fill. What matters in individualistic is me versus collectivism is us, and so forth as we look down. So the last task is apply it to our current situation. So I want you to think about the current situation with COVID-19. How might an understanding of individualistic versus collectivist cultures help us to understand the ways various countries have responded to the virus? So think about, give you an example, the United States. How are we responding currently? What are the types of things that we're doing, that we're being asked to do? Versus somewhere like South Korea, which would be more of a collectivist culture. How did they respond? And how can we look at these differences of responses based on this idea? So once you're done, I'll give you a chance to write. Okay, I'll tell you just a little bit of something you may have said. So in somewhere like the United States, it's more individualistic. It's much more focused on me. So you might hear people talking about being reluctant to do this social distancing. It's inconvenient to me. I'm not at risk. I don't feel like I need to do this. Where in somewhere like South Korea, it's more of a this is my duty to the fellow people in my country, to stay in, to get tested, to do all of those things. So rather than thinking of how does this affect me as an individual, it's how can we all help each other as a group. And that is the end of our notes. Tomorrow you will have one more assignment. It's another podcast. I think you'll enjoy it. It's called The Sorting Hat. So it has a little bit of a Harry Potter twist. It's from Hidden Brain. You'll have a handout to write, and then you should be working on your project. But in terms of that project, now you should have all of the content that you need to get that completed. I hope you have a great Thursday.